Hi, my name is Ethan Luce, and today I'll be continuing with Chapter 22, the Environmental Law. At the beginning of this chapter, it describes the tort law, and this is regulating pollution by using the tort of nuisance. Nuisance is unreasonable interference with someone else's use and enjoyment of his or her land. Negligence is the alternative tort solution and is used when a defendant's polluting behavior harms a plaintiff. The chapter describes the alternative approaches to the environmental protection, and this consists of the government subsidies approach. The government pays for polluters to reduce their emissions, and the disadvantage is firms that limit its pollutants must still pay the difference between the actual cost and the subsidy. The emission charges approach is also one of the alternative approaches to environmental protection. And this charges the polluter a fee on every unit of pollutant discharge. The disadvantage is licensing a continuing C-ROM. The chapter continues with the marketable discharge permits approach. And this is a government sells permits for the discharge of pollutants. Excuse me. The polluters could be encouraged to reduce emissions so that they may sell their permits. The advantage is the government limits the total amount of pollution through the permits, and no permit is issued more than a certain amount of emissions have been authorized, and is used to limit the emission of sulfur. The direct regulation approach is also discussed in the chapter, and this specifies limits on the amount of pollutants that can be discharged. It also introduces the technology forcing standards, which set primarily on the basis of health considerations. Technology-driven standards is also discussed, and this is the attempt to achieve greatest levels of improvement with existing technology. The Environmental Protection Agency, known as the EPA, is also described in the chapter, and this is a federal agency responsible for conducting an integrated, coordinated attack on all forms of environmental pollution. It operates under a policy statement, and its agents look for significant environmental harm and culpable conduct. And the final policy on penalty reductions encourages firms to engage in environmental self-auditing. The National Environment Policy Act of 1970, known as the NEPA, is also described. And this is Title II requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement, known as the EIS. And this must be prepared for every major federal activity that would significantly affect the quality of human environment. The threshold considerations is action must be federal, such as the grant of license. Proposed activity must require sustainable resources, and proposed activity should impact human environment. The environmental impact statement, known as the EIS, is also described, and the content includes the impact of proposed action, unavoided adverse effects, alternatives to the proposed action, analysis of the short-term use of human environment and long-term productivity, and the irreversible or irrevocable commitments of the resources. Its effectiveness of the EIS process is changed the process of agency decision-making. Climate change is also described in the chapter, and this is change in Earth's climate due to greenhouse gases and other pollutants which could trigger the following: melting to the polar ice caps and glaciers, rising ocean water levels, flooding of coastal areas, more storms caused by the mixing of frozen water and warm seawater, and animals will face the danger of extinction and loss of habitat. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, known as RCRA, regulates hazardous and non-hazardous waste with emphasis on control of hazardous waste. Its manifest program provides a cradle-to-grave regulation of hazardous waste. Hazardous waste is any waste material that is ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic with ingested or absorbed. The RCRA amendments of 1984 and 1986 is to make landfills a last resort for disposal of any types of waste. The 1986 amendment is companies should report the amount of hazardous chemicals they release into the environment each year. The environment of RCRA by the EPA states set up programs to be stricken as the federal program. If state fails to act, the EPA enforces state requirements. The Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act of 1986, known as the SRA, is a superfund that covers the cost of cleaning up hazardous waste disposal suits of immediate owners who are missing or are unwilling or unable to pay for the cleanup. It continues with the Toxic Substance Control Act of 1979, the TSCA. And this is a toxic substance, which is chemical or mixtures whose manufacture, processing, distribution, use, or disposal presents an unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment. It's impacted the procedure of evaluating the environmental impacts of chemicals, except those regulated under other acts. The pesticide tolerance in food is also described, and this is under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The EPA establishes legally permissible maximum amounts of pesticide residues in all preceding foods and on food crops. The Pollution Prevention Act of 1990 is also described, and this is encouraged further progression by providing information incentive grants to spur innovation. It's enabled voluntary pollution prevention among businesses. It's enabled sustainable development, which meets the needs for current generation without compromising the needs of future generations. And then lastly for the chapter is the primary responses of the United States in establishing global environment policies. This includes research. Research are shared with others and shared with other nations, and conferences, which are held to discuss transnational environmental problems. Treaties, which are written agreements between nations that describe an issue that is to be solved, and aid, which is offered when certain environmental sound conditions are met. So that's all I have for this chapter. It was very interesting learning about the environment and the certain laws that protects it from hazardous and hazardous materials. Thanks.